I'm in government and history. I teach largely critical thinking classes here which deal with argumentation. Todd and I got to know each other because we're both scholars on Aristotle. Todd works primarily on the rhetoric. I work on the rhetoric, Aristotle's two ethics, and his politics. And usually the context in which I'm working with Aristotle are philosophy or political science, trying to show the usefulness of studying his rhetoric. So here I don't have to make that sale. Aristotle, when we started talking about this, jumped out as somebody who would be particularly useful in understanding the intersection between ethics and rhetoric. Because Aristotle worked on both of those, and he has a very systematic, comprehensive philosophical view. I don't think that you have to understand all of Aristotle's system in order to draw some useful concepts from it. And Aristotle's text, I'm going to bring up some of the useful concepts that he has in there. And they're all systematically connected, so if you wanted to go further with studying this, you could. One of the key ones that I'm going to talk about is Aristotelian moral theory values actions in terms of virtue, vice, and character. Not simply in terms of the action itself. That's different than many other moral theories. There's a role for rhetoric in ethical action for Aristotle, which again is very different than many other moral philosophies where rhetoric is often seen as something bad. I'm going to talk about 3 different modes of rhetorical persuasion that anybody who's taken a lit theory class or rhetoric class will know. I'm going to talk about communication, community, and how moral values are tied in with that and what that might mean for flaming. And I'm going to also talk about Aristotle's understanding of the emotions, which is very sophisticated, very, very nuanced, and I think very helpful. A lot of contemporary psychological theory, in fact, either draws upon or mimics, without realizing it, Aristotle's theory of the emotions. For instance, the book Emotional Intelligence. Any of you come across that before? A book you should have, because it's very useful for a lot of contexts. It begins with a quote by Aristotle, one of the quotes that I'm actually going to bring up here. The first chapter is actually titled Aristotle's Challenge. So Aristotle's really helpful for these things that involve the emotions, involve speech, and he's useful for evaluating flaming. So let's start with Aristotle's ethics. We call it virtue ethics because what it values is not simply particular actions, it values states of character or virtues. Virtues are good dispositions or habits, things that we as a society think are good. Vices, we're used to thinking of vices in terms of smoking or swearing or spitting or things that people don't like. Vices are the whole panoply of bad habits that people have. So being a stingy person is an example of a vice. Being a generous person is an example of a virtue. Being courageous, an example of a virtue. Being a coward, or on the other hand, being so rash that you're getting into fights all the time, those are examples of vices. The actions that a person does reveal their character. Somebody might object, well, couldn't the person be, acting out of character? Couldn't this be an exception? Yeah, that's true. But Aristotle doesn't think that you only look at one action. You can look at patterns of action, and then you can evaluate people. You can say that some people are good or bad people, depending on the composition of their character, whether they have more vices, whether they have more virtues. So for most actions and emotions, which is what we're interested in evaluating, it's not a yes or no question. It's not an absolute question. Is this action always, in every case, no qualifications, good or bad? Moral life and moral valuation is a matter of context, and flaming fits into that. So Aristotle would say that something like flaming is generally bad, but it could have good ends. It could be put to good purposes. It's not necessarily bad. It depends on what it's going to tie in with. This is a quote from Aristotle that actually not only emotional intelligence, but a lot of papers begin with. Anybody can become angry. That's easy. We all know that. We've all experienced that. And actually becoming angry in the wrong way is a sign of vicious behavior. It's a lack of character. It's a deficient character. But to be angry with the right person, in the right degree, and at the right time, for the right purpose, in the right way, these are qualifications. Anger can actually be something good. It can actually be something that you ought to feel. You know, there are circumstances in which if you don't feel angry, there's something wrong with you. You're deficient in a different way. You have a different type of vice, which in our society is much more rare. More angry people, too angry for the wrong reason, at the wrong time, with the wrong person, than there are people who don't get angry at all. But there are people on both sides. For Aristotle, the virtue is going to be something in the middle. That's what he calls the mean. And the mean is evaluated in terms of these sorts of qualifications. These are all contextual. So flaming can be evaluated in the same way. Is somebody flaming the right person to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, in the right way? Those are questions that you can ask from an Aristotelian perspective. Todd talked about some of the motives that people have for flaming, and these tie in with the desires and the emotions, Aristotle would say. One of the greatest ones is anger, of course. Why do people flame? Many of them are flaming because they're angry with the person who they're flaming. That person has said something that triggered them in some way. They could be angry about the subject matter. Some people come into chat rooms, some people come into Facebook discussions. You're all familiar with this, and they had a bad day, and they want to say something derogatory or mean to somebody. They're not angry at the person that they're flaming yet. They probably will get angry at them, but they're just angry. They're looking for something to fix it on. Sometimes they're angry with the person, and they flame them because they perceive the person as having insulted them, or put them down, or belittled them, or even not paid attention to them. Aristotle actually says that one of the main causes of anger, in addition to just insult or injury, is what he calls in Greek kataphronesis, which literally means to look down upon somebody, to treat them as less than they are. And Aristotle says it's not whether it actually exists or not, whether they did it, it's whether it's perceived. When we perceive that sort of thing, we get angry. There's other possibilities. Envy. If somebody is envious, that's already for Aristotle a sign of bad character. It's not possible to feel envy to the right degree, at the right time, with the right person. It is possible to feel something like envy, he says, that he calls emulation. When you feel bad because you see somebody doing well, and you really wish that you measured up to that, that's good. When you feel bad because you see somebody doing well, and you just hate them because of that, that's bad. That's envy. Hatred by itself. Hatred is a very strong emotion. Aristotle actually distinguishes it very clearly from anger. And hatred is much more lasting. Anger is temporary. Hatred, Aristotle, consists in the wish that the other person not exist. When you truly hate somebody, or when you truly hate something, you don't just want to punish it. You don't just want to make it hurt. You want it ultimately to be effaced. You want it to be blotted out. And many people come into online conversations filled with hatred. So those are people who are going to be prone to flaming. Fear. One might actually flame other people because one is afraid. There are a lot of actions that can tip into that. Of course, all these emotions can transform into each other. Fear very easily turns into the anger response. Hit the button by mistake. Pleasure. Aristotle calls it an unnamed emotion. The Germans came up with a name for it called Schadenfreude, and it literally means the joy in damaging in German. Some people just enjoy hurting other people. We also call that sadism, right? Putting people down is bullying them, insulting them. One might do that just because one enjoys it, and that's going to lead to flaming behavior. The trolling would be an example of that. It might also be a matter of camaraderie. Some of the literature that we started looking at was very interesting. Found that there were cases where other people were perceiving things as being flaming but it was really an in-group of people who were insulting each other because that's what they did for fun with each other. Just like in a family or in a sports team or in a circle of friends, you might call your friends names, and it's okay for you to call them names, it's okay for you to put them down, but if somebody else came in from the outside and started doing that, you would be very upset. That occurs sometimes in flaming. Now, ethical counter-flaming, the sort of thing that we're talking about here, what would motivate it emotionally? I mean, you could do it as a calm, cool, collected person who says to themselves, as a practical reasoner, this is really damaging to my community. I should flame this person just to, establish some guidelines, make sure that they aren't damaging the community. That's not usually how it happens, though. Aristotle recognizes that we can often do the right thing while being motivated by emotions, but it's going to be a matter of, virtuous emotions. Anger can be felt, like he said, in the right degree, at the right time, with the right person, and that could be something motivating ethical counterflaming. Also what he calls righteous indignation. It's a Greek word that is nemesis. We translate it usually as righteous indignation. This is the feeling that you feel, which is somewhat different than anger, when you see somebody else prospering who doesn't deserve to prosper, or being hurt who doesn't deserve to be hurt. So in the case of this, there would be a bit of both of that. The person who's flaming is setting themselves above the other person who they're attacking, and the person who's being flamed is being set below. So one could feel the right response to that. And Aristotle actually thinks that's a good thing. Of course, he didn't have the internet at that time, but this was occurring in day-to-day interactions. Now, Aristotle is very attuned to the relationship between language and community. And this is very interesting because how do we have community in online forms? It's not through seeing each other, although we do now have video chat. It's through words. Language is part of what makes us human. Sure, other animals do have their things that we call language, but as far as we know, they don't actually do what human language does. Human language not only allows us to pick out objects and to say things about them, it allows us to talk about moral values. Now, this is part of what it means to be human. So even the the lower functioning human beings in this respect are much more higher functioning than any other animal is, because they're involved in this network of communication. Other animals, Aristotle says, they talk about the pleasurable and the harmful. Deer, when they lift their tail, what are they doing? They're signaling, let's get the hell out of here. And why are they doing that? Because something scared them and they're saying something is harmful. Dogs whine when they feel upset. Right? We also signify to each other things being useful and harmful, just and unjust. Dogs don't, get on each other's case for being bad dogs. Cats don't ask themselves, did I do the right thing? Maybe dolphins do. We don't know, because we don't know what most of that click language means. We also have aesthetic responses. We spend a lot of our time actually talking about what's beautiful or what's ugly, what's elevated or noble is the word that Aristotle uses, or base. And we have a lot of different synonyms for this. And we also talk about the good and the bad in a lot of different modes. So what is it that people actually fight about? What is it that they flame about? It's these things in our language. And Aristotle saw that this is part of our human nature. So we're probably not going to be able to escape this. These values are the basis for our human communities at every single level. From the family unit, within the family we have some sort of agreements about these things, all the way up to the highest level of civilizations, where we could say contrast American civilization versus Chinese civilization versus civilizations that have ceased to exist, like say the Aztec civilization. And we communicate about these values, and we also share in perceiving and experiencing these values, Aristotle says. Now, that's great, that's the nice part, but these are also grounds for misunderstanding. These are also grounds for conflict. We don't all see things the same way. So what are flames going to be about? In large part, they're going to be about moral evaluations. They'll take the form of things like, well, you're a jerk. No, you're a jerk. Why do you say I'm a jerk? Because obviously you did this, this, and this. But those are actually arguments about moral values. And those are the sorts of things that we want to be attuned to. Aristotle also realizes, and this is what gets back to Todd's talk about why one might flame to preserve what's going on within a community. There are certain goods of human life that can only be realized in a community. There are many goods that you can have on your own. Anybody can go off and eat chocolate by themselves, right? If you eat chocolate, I don't taste your chocolate. There are some goods that can only be truly communicated or experienced with a few people. But then there's some that require an entire community. And some of the goods that come about because of communication are in that category. So a flamer coming in is threatening either the existence or the access to those sorts of goods. Think, for example, of what you feel when you are discussing something that you're passionate about and very interested in with somebody else who shares that passion and who knows more than you do, who can tune you into things. Now imagine somebody else is coming along and insulting you at the same time. That good becomes unrealizable in that context. That's what flaming can do. Now, how do ethics and rhetoric, we've talked a lot about ethics so far, how does rhetoric fit in with this? Aristotle actually thinks that rhetoric has an irreplaceable role in human life. Not just a legitimate role, but an irreplaceable role. It has to be used to lead people to correct judgment about actions and characters. And one thing to keep in mind that I didn't put on here, most of the time when you're having an argument with another person, you're not only arguing with that other person, you're arguing with two other audiences. This is sort of a rhetorical point. You're arguing in part with yourself, because you could actually be convinced by that other person. You're reinforcing whatever it is that you're saying. And if you're actually a true critical thinker, you may in fact allow yourself to be swayed by the other person, especially if you find yourself using very bad arguments or not having evidence for what you say. But you're also arguing towards, not necessarily with, but towards the larger audience. So if you're caught in a flame war, you're not only looking to the other person who you're trying to maybe convince or maybe just put down in silence. You're also addressing the larger audience who's there, all the other users. So rhetoric has to be used for that. Aristotle also thinks that all instruction and formation, especially moral formation, and we're constantly in the process of moral formation. You're in that process until you die. If you're becoming a better and better person through the course of your life, it's probably not entirely on your own. It's probably through engaging other people whose thoughts inform yours, or who point out insights to you. All instruction and formation involves some persuasion. It's going to involve some use of rhetoric. Rhetoric can be used as an effective weapon against those who violate the norms, who display bad or even underdeveloped character. Quite often, this may sound kind of harsh, but we've all experienced this at one time or another. If somebody's not on the right track, they're not genuinely bad, you may still need to punish them. You may still need to, confront them. And that may actually be a good thing for them. Rhetoric can be part of that. So flaming can be part of that. It can also be used to get people to understand what good and bad things are involved or at stake in the situations. You might actually point out in a situation of flaming, hey, you are screwing up the community here. And some of the responses, in fact, do that. Aristotle actually distinguishes three basic modes of rhetorical persuasion, artful persuasion, things other than just simply punishing somebody. And all of them use language as a tool. There's logos, ethos, and pathos. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I don't want to run out of time. Logos would include the possible response of trying to reason with the person. Logos is using language argumentatively. You might use rhetorical tropes to contain, to redirect, or even silence the verbal aggressor. By verbal tropes, we mean sort of stock verbal acts. And Aristotle's texts are actually full of these, because many of the ones that we use today were used by the ancient Greeks. As a matter of fact, his book, which is called The Art of Rhetoric, a good portion of it just consists in, well, in this situation you might say this, you might say this, you might say this, you might say this. And they're all ways to take somebody and take their position or their argument and turn it on its head. That's why lawyers study the rhetoric, actually. You might actually engage in applied moral philosophy. That's if you actually have the sort of material that you could work with. Somebody who's flaming because they don't really have a bad character, but they're misunderstanding people, or things like that. Ethos, which Dr. Frobish has done some work on as well, this is a somewhat underdeveloped area in Aristotelian rhetoric. It involves character, modeling ourselves after other people, presenting ourselves as models to other people, picking out who are good models, who are bad models, virtues, vices, and something that he calls proairesis, which means moral choice. The sort of choices that set the fabric of your character. Another thing that ties in with that, criticizing, praising, saying that somebody's a good person, saying somebody's a bad person, saying why. Those reveal both the character of the person who's being criticized or being praised, and also the character of the person who's doing the praising or criticizing. And then narrative, telling stories about people. These are all possible things that could be used as responses to flaming. These are ways to use rhetoric to get things done, to corral people. Three things that go into being persuasive, Aristotle talks about: seeming like you're actually smart, having practical wisdom, knowing how to get things done, being a good person or not, and having goodwill towards other people. So these could be things to point out to somebody flaming. Hey, if you want people to actually listen to you, you need to actually at least sound like somebody who cares about other people, or who actually likes good things. You know. Then there's pathos. Pathos means emotion, and we have appeals to emotion. The rhetor, the speaker, can arouse or quell emotion in the audience to affect behavior and judgments, because we don't see things the same way when we're angry, or when we're hateful, or when we're friends with somebody, or when we're happy. Even more important, they can redirect or manipulate the emotion in the audience. Now, why is this important? When people are flaming, their emotions are engaged. Very often they're flaming precisely because they're feeling a certain way, so they type it out very quickly. They're being led by emotions. So if you can redirect their emotions, that can be very helpful. And ultimately, from an Aristotelian perspective, what we're trying to aim at is allowing people to have some sort of self-control or self-mastery over their emotions, to not just be responding just like that on the basis of their emotions, to be able to determine whether they're good or bad.